Welcome to the G20 Interfaith Podcast, a platform where we explore the intersection of faith, global challenges, and policy.
Welcome to another episode of the G20 Interfaith Forum podcast. My name is Stuart Bird. Today, Whitney Clayton and I are hosting, and we're delighted to be joined by Michael Young. Michael Young, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
To give you an initial introduction to Michael Young, I'm going to read a quick bio. Michael Young serves on the IF20 Advisory Council. His previous experiences include the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He served as the president of the University of Utah, the president of the University of Washington, and the president of Texas A&M University. He also served in the Department of State as Deputy Undersecretary of the Economic Affairs and Ambassador for Trade and Environmental Affairs. Michael, you have a very diverse background with a lot more than what I just included in that quick little paragraph. I know that you are also involved with a lot of interfaith and freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. What led you to be involved specifically with interfaith and freedom of religion or belief?
Well, Stuart, thank you. It was a bit coincidental in a way. I'm very active in my own religion and have served that in a proselytizing capacity in Asia and so forth. So it's always been very central to me. But I had the opportunity, as you mentioned earlier, to work in the State Department. And while I was there, ended up doing some human rights related negotiations and leading some delegations where we worked on those sorts of issues. I was at the time on leave from Columbia University, where I was a professor for many years. When I got back to Columbia, we had a wonderful professor named Lou Henkin. Lou is in many ways one of the founders of international human rights, along with Tom Bergenthal and Louis Sohn, and sort of in that group. And Lou, very active in the Jewish faith. I was very active in my faith. And yet we both had worked in the human rights area. And Lou wanted to start a program where we actually tried to look at faith-based organizations and human rights-based organizations and people who had interest in that, and show them how much they had in common and how they could work together to advance their collective agendas. Much of the time, they spit and snarl against each other across this divide. The faith-based organizations think that the human rights proponents are, godless heathens, and the human rights people think that those people doing religious liberties are just trying to make the world safe for proselytizing and are, right-wing religious nuts. Neither is true. I mean, their common interests are tremendous. So we started a program. We got a generous grant from the Pew Charitable Trust. And what we did is we brought religious liberties advocates. It was right after the Soviet Union had dissolved. And so we brought in religious liberties advocates from a number of former communist countries, or sometimes still communist countries, and did a long-term training program at Columbia. They did a semester in human rights. And we used to describe the program as, how to take people who are irritating to their governments and how to make them more irritating, give them the human rights background and help them network. And then we provided a 6-month internship in an international human rights organization. But that led me into looking at how much religions could advance these other agendas in terms of making the world a better place, in not just on an individual basis, but certainly on an individual basis, but even more how they could stimulate the expansion of people's opportunities in life and their freedoms and their capacity to teach their children what they wanted to teach them and develop their own lives, as well as that in turn contributes dramatically to the countries they're in and so forth. And that was really the foundation. It's a long explanation. I apologize for that, but it really gave me a particular perspective on this, and that's been something I've been sort of pressing, I guess, ever since.
That's beautiful, Mike. I appreciate you sharing that. There's actually something I'd like to dive in just a little bit deeper because I hear something in that I identify with. I've been with the IF20 for 1 year, and the thing that I've found that I love the most about it is that both the topics that we're addressing and the people that I'm meeting, watching and observing the work that they do, I feel something. It actually moves my soul. I'm inspired by the people that I'm with. And as I hear you talk about freedom of conscience, religion, belief, as I hear you talk about human rights, and then the effects, bringing people together, potentially from opposite original starting points, maybe politically or ideologically or religiously, but bringing them together in a way that you could see people's lives benefited in places where their freedoms were lacking. I sense that there was something, and this is, I imagine this is 30 or 40 or maybe longer ago for you, that must have moved you to say, I'm going to follow this opportunity. Am I hearing you correctly? Is there something about that? Because I want to hear what moved you. What was it back then that inspired you?
Much of the work I did in the State Department and other places was thinking about how do you, how do you, I mean, it sounds very simplistic, but how do you make the world a better place? And the answer is usually relatively simple, is you turn people loose to try to realize their own lives and their own ambitions. And that is particularly powerful when those people's lives are centered around faith-based organizations, because that has potentially a great deal of a moral center of gravity, a tremendous ethical center of gravity. And when you see what religions are capable of doing around the world, I mean, if you go to Africa, for example, I mean, we were talking about that a little bit earlier. If you go to Africa, the huge percentage of the healthcare, of the education, and so forth, all come out of faith-based organizations. And I think that one of the things that is so attractive about the IF20 association, when we think about it, is many of the things that religions have helped advance on both an individual basis and a societal basis are exactly the goals that the IF20 wants to advance in the countries, in their countries, and set up models that help advance those same things in the rest of the world. Education is a good example. I mean, when you look, even a very recent study shows that, people who are faith-based tend to have higher levels of engagement with education. They tend to have better health outcomes. Countries that allow freedom of religion it tends to be highly correlated with advanced economic development. And then none of that is surprising to me. So, I mean, there's a concern. There's always a concern underlying that as well, which is if a government begins to engagement with religion to provide some of the services, begin to preference one religion over another, begin to suppress other religions, and that's a real concern. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily easy. All you have to do is wave a wand and say, okay, go talk to the Mr. President or Mr. Prime Minister, go work with the local religions. Much more complicated than that. But when done right, it has the potential to create societal developments in which people's lives are just better, and their opportunities are better to realize their full humanity and expression. And I love that. I think it's hard, but I think it's a interesting and from my perspective, a really worthwhile way of approaching this.
Thank you, Michael. It seems like if I'm understanding correctly, freedom of religion or belief has so much potential to do good in a society, in a country, but it's hard. It takes some serious intention. I know that something that the United States has done in order to research and figure out the best way to promote freedom of religion or belief is by creating the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan legislative branch agency that monitors religious freedom violations globally and makes policy recommendations in the U.S. specifically to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. I know you served on this commission. What was your role, and what did you see come out of that role that you thought was particularly impactful?
Well, I had the enormous good fortune, as I say, much of my life has been sort of luck, and this was certainly part of it. It was created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which did a series of things. One is it required the State Department to produce a report. It required the State Department to create an ambassadorial position within the State Department, focusing on freedom of religion as part of our foreign policy, how we advance freedom of thought, conscience, and belief as part of our foreign policy. And then the commission was set up as a 9-person independent commission, 3 appointed by the White House, 3 by the House of Representatives, and 3 by the Senate. And I was one of the first 2 appointees, actually, David Saperstein and I. So when you ask what my role was, we sort of set it up. I mean, the logistics of it and so forth. It was really interesting because nobody was quite sure how it ought to operate and what it ought to do. Anyway, I served on it for about a decade as kind of alternating between chair and vice chair most of the time. But the idea of it was essentially to have an outside objective look at issues of freedom of religion around the world and how our foreign policy apparatus could weave that more robustly into our foreign policy. I mean, our Congress's view was very much, the view I think of the members who ended up on this commission is that the world is a better place when you have freedom of religion. Countries tend not to fight wars. I mean, it's sort of like Tom Friedman's, countries that have McDonald's don't fight wars against each other. Well, the same thing is true with freedom of religion. It is good for us. They identify with U.S. principles. It makes the world a place more compatible and able to work on those fundamental issues that we think important as a global matter. And so the idea was you would have this commission. It would review. It would identify ways in which U.S. foreign policy could be focused on that, consistent with U.S. interests. It wasn't a question of, abandoning U.S. Global interests, but how it advanced those interests and weave it into our U.S. foreign policy. And then we were to advise the president, the Secretary of State, and the Congress.
Mike, one of the things that I love about this is that you have experience at the high level, literally setting the stage worldwide and thinking about the issues and how they'll ripple out through U.S. foreign policy and geopolitics. But you also have a lot of experience at the local in specific instances. So I want to turn from the broad from the general to the particular for a moment and talk about your time as the president of the University of Utah. It's the largest state university in the state of Utah, and there's a strong base of students from one majority religious group. But that doesn't mean they're the only students on campus, and there's a lot of diversity in that campus population among students and among professors. So would you mind talking for a moment about sort of the opportunities and the challenges that you faced in that context and things that you did as president to try to develop campus unity and bring the right spirit of togetherness on that campus during your time?
Well, I appreciate that question. It was not something I'd thought enormous amount about. I had grown up in Utah and gone to college in Utah, but then once I graduated from college, I've been outside of Utah the whole time. And in areas in which my religion was decidedly a minority and so forth. And it was pretty non-problematic about it. I didn't think the fact that I was a different religion from anybody else I was working with was ever a problem. I mean, I just never saw that. So we got to Utah, I thought, well, this shouldn't be an issue. But people kind of behind the scenes, they weren't very explicit about it. Behind the scenes, a lot of people tell me, look, there's this tension between the Mormons and those who aren't of the Mormon faith. And it's the only place I've ever been where both the majority and the minority think that they are persecuted minorities. I find that pretty amusing. But anyway, so I got to the University of Utah, and my general principle was really pretty simple, which is we're not going to worry much about that. What we all share in common, really desire to make the university great, to expand our programs, raise our sites, and elevate the university, and we're not going to look at our differences. We all share that as a commonality. We're going to look at that. And I did not think it was a particular problem. But it was important, I think, at the same time, to make sure that we were communicating with people about our shared values all the time. I'll give you a small example. When I got to the University of Utah, like many universities around the country, it was just prior to the Supreme Court's determination on the possibilities of gay marriage. So we had a number of professors and so forth who had gay partners who did not get any of the benefits that a married couple would get. That seemed to me wrong, but it did not seem to me useful to go in and say, look, I want to give some preference to gay people. That wasn't what this was about. This was about saying, look, people who have similar kinds of relationships that we support in one way, anybody who has that kind of relationship, we should support. And that would include not only gay partners, but it would include people taking care of elderly parents, or people taking care of children who, for some reason or another, had a life that did not permit them to become independent yet, and so forth. And we weren't doing any of that. And so you go both on the Mormon side and those who might have more support for gay rights. It didn't matter to me. What I was talking about was basic human beings having the kind of support in the home environment and the supportive environment that they had created. And I went to the legislature, described it that way. They were very comfortable with it. Ironically, we became one of the top 10 gay-friendly schools in the nation, but that wasn't what we were trying to do. We were trying to look at what that commonality was in terms of interest and say, look, we both, whatever you think about these other things, what we share is really the center part of it in terms of our compassion, in terms of our humanity, in terms of our support for people. Let's focus on that, build structures around that, do that, and then whatever you want to do in your private life, that's fine. But that's not where we come together. We come together, and Utah for me was a marvelous experience. I mean, it's just people when you got to those fundamentals of what we really feel and believe and act on, it was great. I mean, I see a lot of the same thing I'm now in a very different environment in Saudi Arabia, we're in the middle of Ramadan. Ramadan's just ending. One of the things you do during Ramadan is you fast all day, and then you focus on one of the main tenets of Islam, which is you give charity. And they're very intentional and consequential about that. And yet, if you're a Christian, you think about the injunctions to take care of the widows and the orphans and so forth. That's you see those commonalities. And build on those, and I think that's freedom of religion gives you an opportunity to do that, as long as you're not using religion as a manipulative political device or things like that. If there are other ways in which, and that also appeals to the non-religious. I'm not one who says that the the only way in the world is religion. I mean, a lot of people are, are very steeped in developing their own ethical standards and so forth, but they tend to have tremendous commonalities.
Thank you, Mike. The phrase that's coming to my mind as I hear you talking about these examples of experiences that you had is the freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. Sometimes we just think about freedom of religion or belief, but the freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. I want to turn our conversation to that. Is there a definition for that term, freedom of thought, conscience, and belief? What does that mean when we hear that phrase?
Well, they're actually, I mean, that's usually debated. I mean, what it essentially means is that, government, or in my judgment, any institution in society should not have any mechanisms to be able to sort of control what you think, and control what you believe, or how you espouse or express that. Now, I certainly understand there have to be limits on how you behave with respect to those beliefs, but being able to hold your belief, and within the ring-fenced area of not imposing those on others or affecting others, that you should be able to live that. You should be able to do that. You should be able to teach your children. You should be able to express that in whatever way matters to you, whether that is through ritual and rites, whether that is through the kinds of gatherings you can have, whether it's through the kinds of materials you can read and think about, the kinds of things you can write and say. It should have that. I mean, there are probably as many definitions of this as there are people in the area, thinking about this. But for me, it really goes back to the basics.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Mike. And it sounds like also from the various vantage points that you've been able to watch trends emerge worldwide over the course of a handful of decades now. What do you see as areas of success as you've watched these trends worldwide, and where do you see areas of opportunity going forward in freedom of belief and conscience and religion?
I've always been struck by a place like Indonesia, which has very, very large Muslim population, but it has Buddhist, Christians, Hindu as well. And they have been very good about allowing everybody kind of their own space, and you will have there's an attack on a Christian church, and the leadership of the country will come in and basically help rebuild that church and so forth. It's declined a little in recent years, but I think it was really kind of an interesting model, because it was a place where it could have been so explosive, and yet they sort of did that in an interesting way. And of course, the U.S., much of Western Europe, all really follow that great kind of Lockean principles, which is if you have one religion, it suppresses others. If you have two, they fight against each other. But if you allow hundreds of religions, nobody has that power to control the other. Nobody has the need or inclination to fight to protect their own religion. And so there are a lot of places where it's very robust, and I think that's terrific.
We know that you're currently living in Saudi Arabia, and you're able to witness freedom of religion and belief trends there, and other parts of that region. In Saudi Arabia, you're working with a new educational institution called NEOM. Tell us more about what that is and your role, and also how this has presented challenges and opportunities from an interfaith perspective.
Well, NEOM is one of the Crown Prince's major sort of giga projects, they call them, up in the northwest part of Saudi Arabia, designed to build an entire kind of high-tech digital community of the future with this very unique architecture that allows people to live in a much less spread out space so they can take more advantage of nature. At the same time, very environmentally friendly, carbon neutral, things like that, with a very dynamic economy and an ability, but also an ability to create community. I mean, the idea is that this area will be built. It's not supposed to be 100 miles long, but in segments where everything you need will be walking distance and so forth. So you really are able to generate within that space, a sense of community and so forth. Also having a high-end economic system and a port and so forth. And I was brought in to help them design and start building the educational system, K through 12, universities, research foundations, research institutes and so forth, vocational training, professional training and advancement, and so forth. In terms of the interfaith perspective, part of this follows on in the tremendous reforms that have undergone. I mean, we call them reforms in the West, to be sure. Whether they would call them that there or not, I'm not entirely sure. But there's been a lot of opening up in terms of like women's rights, for example. They don't have to wear the hijab anymore. You see people, you'll see three generations of people walking in a mall, and a slightly older woman will be wearing the hijab. The younger woman, who's probably the daughter, will be, in the very smart business suit or modern clothes, and the granddaughter will be, wearing cutoffs and a t-shirt. And they can drive, they can go out by themselves. The religious police that really enforced a lot of these rules have been somewhat backed off. I think that they have concerts, music, sporting events, and it's been an opening up with the idea. The fundamental idea is, look, you define how you live your religion. Here are the basic principles, and they have not lost any of the focus. They are the guardians of the two holy mosques. They're Mecca and Medina are in Saudi Arabia and under their control. They run the Hajj. Where millions and anywhere from 5 to 7 million people come in every year and do the Hajj, and so forth. But one is very, but where I am, I'm perfectly free to practice my religion if I want. But they're very good at helping those of us who aren't Muslim be respectful of their faith. I mean, during Ramadan, for example, you fast from sunup to sundown, and we get a little notice just urging us. If you're having a meeting with people, they come to work and so forth. But if you're having a meeting with people, it's probably not polite to sit there and drink drinks and eat while they're all fasting. Things like that, and the vacations. Vacations really respect their holy calendar. The Eid, al-Fitr, and the other Eid. The one that ends Ramadan and the other one a few months later. So there's an encouragement there, and I think virtually all of the foreigners I know very respectful, and so forth, but don't feel oppressed. Now, those who drink may feel a tad oppressed because they still don't. Alcohol's not available, but those of us who don't drink, you don't feel any oppression if you're not part of that religion, and I don't sense that the presence of those of us who are not Muslims are that the Muslims feel like we are interfering with their capacity to live their religion and worship their faith. For me, it's a very new experience, but very interesting.
That's really cool. One of the themes that I hear coming through a lot of these thoughts is the notion of respect, the respect that you afford to the hosts in the country in which you work and to the religion that they practice, and also the respect that they afford you. And I wonder, as you look back, whether it's State Department or at one of the universities where you've been a leader, or in the work that you're doing now in Saudi Arabia or freedom of religion work, I bet you've met a lot of people who have been uh, inspiring to you, who have been heroes of sorts. Is there someone that you could share something with us about? Someone that you admire, someone where that friendship has enriched your life, something that you've learned from someone in these areas? Are there any specifics you could share with us?
Well, I mentioned very early on my Columbia experience with Lou Henkin. Um, I have had an opportunity to meet a lot of people in this space that come from this issue from either the very secular side or the faith-based side, and have just been really been blessed to watch how these people stay true to their core values, but how they identify their core values with your core values. And so you're not looking at, where do we differ, but what do we all share in a really, really profound way. And that goes beyond religion. I mean, it goes even to people who are, not faith-based, to be sure, but people who look for that, people like Lou Henkin who look for that, and then have contributed as much as anybody in the world probably in terms of thinking about what governmental infrastructure and human rights need to be available to have people collaborate and cooperate and so forth on that core, but at the same time be true to whatever is unique about their particular faith-based dimension or their philosophical-based principles. People like that. Cole Durham is another one. I had the privilege of Cole was a year ahead of me in law school, taught me everything I know, but the privilege of working with Cole, who is probably as sensitive to this as any human being I've ever met, has really taught me an enormous amount about how one looks to that core, protects that core, allows people to collaborate across, creates ways in which people can really work together across that core, recognize that core, but still stay true to whatever unique dimension there is about their belief system as well.
Thank you, Michael. There's a term that sometimes gets referenced at IF20 events called holy envy. And it's used to describe understanding something about someone else's religious tradition and recognizing that their insight or practice enriches spiritual opportunities in ways outside of one's own religious tradition. And this kind of goes back to what you were explaining with recognizing what is involved in someone else's religion and seeing how what that brings to the table and what that offers to the world. Have you experienced this holy envy, and where have you experienced that?
Virtually everywhere I've lived. I've had the opportunity to live for some number of years in Asia, and watching Buddhism in a really profound and powerful way, as I mean, it's an extraordinary vision of people and how the central principles of compassion are so central to that, and ways in which that gets expressed has really helped me think about my own religion in a much deeper way, I think. Spent a little time in India. I'm really tremendously struck by Hinduism. There are things about it that don't resonate with me particularly, to be sure. But part of it is, the notion, we think about the caste system and people being reborn in different situations is it's a little kind of an odd concept for me, and maybe others as well, but certainly for me. On the one hand, on the other hand, what it really helps people think through in a really deep way is, okay, this is my lot in life. How do I do that within the context in which I'm born, with the whatever opportunities and skills I have? How do I do the best I possibly can to make the world a better place, to make life better, to do this thing? Whether I am, basically a rag picker in India or a Brahmin, what do I do within that context? That to me is really profound. It's sort of this plant your own garden and tend it, and then share it in an interesting way. I mentioned earlier Islam. Tremendously impressed with how seriously they take this notion of taking care of the widows and the orphans. This is zakat, the contributions, the charitable contributions they make, and they are, to use the word in both senses of the word as well, they are religious about it. They are, and I as I reflect on the scriptures I read, we sometimes get wrapped around the axle on, gee, this behavior is really unacceptable and that behavior is unacceptable. And there may be one small mention of that in the Bible, where at the same time, there are literally thousands of injunctions to take care of the widows and the orphans and the less fortunate and so forth. And we kind of, elide over that and look at these other kind of, my religion, for example, I take seriously the fact that, we have prescriptions with respect to drinking and smoking and so forth. But it's easy to get wrapped around the axle and judge people on that, while at the same time, we're not looking at what the real heart of my religion, which is that kind of compassion and so forth. The Saudis have that, the Islam, when done right, really has that as a central focus in an interesting way. So so this has been the opportunity I've had to not be able to hold a job but have to keep moving around has really had just a tremendous impact as I think about my own ethical center of gravity and how I understand my religion and how I try to live it.
This is wonderful. These have been delightful reflections, Mike, and I appreciate your answers. I experience, as I listen to you, a sense of genuine passion. I mean, I know you are a professor or have been a professor. You're an academic, but as I listen to you speak, I don't hear someone speaking from just the abstract academic perspective. I hear someone speaking with conviction and authenticity about these issues, about belief and about religion, about the contributions religion can make, and about the opportunities to unify around shared values and the opportunity to actually improve lives along the parameters that we're discussing today. I hear real genuine conviction from you. And so I wonder if, as a concluding question, if you might speak for a second about just a little bit about your own spiritual journey and how has God shaped your life personally?
I was fortunate to be born in a family that had a strong tradition of the Mormon Church, but not always participating in it for a variety of reasons, quite as much as maybe they had before. And for me, it gave me a lot of room to. I mean, these are extraordinary people. My grandfather, one of very much from the old school of the Mormon Church. He served 3 missions for the LDS Church. He and his companion were the first 2 LDS missionaries in San Diego, for example, which now has hundreds of thousands of Mormons. They were still lynching missionaries. He actually replaced a missionary who'd just been lynched in the South, and so forth. He bishop for like 32 years of one of the local congregations, and he was older, and so actually attending church every single week. He would go periodically, but it wasn't always possible. But would talk a lot about it. It just gave but gave me a chance to, in a somewhat more reflective environment, to kind of explore it on my own. It wasn't imposed on me. It was kind of there for the taking, but not imposed. And that in the end for me was enormously valuable, and it required a lot of wrestling with what I really believe and what I really want to do, and I was fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of people who helped me through that throughout my life, and then opportunities to basically express it in ways that to me are the most important central tenets of it, which is I believe we're here to try and make the world a better place, to do good. And, however we define that becomes critical, but however we do it also becomes critical. And looking, for me, that then formulates looking for opportunities to do that. Have I everywhere I've been, have I been able to make it better? And so it's both been kind of a framework for life, but also has had, for me at least, a real kind of moral imperative of a certain kind of action, and that's that. And I've just been it's really been wonderful to have a lot of people been tremendously supportive and help me see how to do that and live through that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Thank you also for just your continuing collaboration in the IF20 and in moving forward what we're trying to accomplish by bringing people of goodwill together, leaving the divisiveness or the places where we might disagree philosophically or politically at the door, and coming in and finding places where we do agree. And you've mentioned a lot of them. Has to do often with health, with education, with migration issues, with women and children. A lot of times we use the phrase protecting the vulnerable or caring for the vulnerable, because I think that maybe we can use in a religious context the term spark of the divine, that's something that we share in that core animation and core motivation. Thank you for your efforts alongside everybody else in making that happen at the IF20. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of the G20 Interfaith Forum podcast.
The podcast provides information and discussions on the G20 Interfaith Forum, but the views expressed are those of the individuals involved and not necessarily the official stance of the forum.
The content is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice or expert recommendations. Listeners should exercise personal responsibility, seek professional guidance, and conduct further research when making decisions based on the podcast.
The information shared may not always reflect the most current developments, and external links or resources are provided for additional information but are not endorsed or controlled by the podcast.
By listening to the podcast, listeners acknowledge and accept these disclaimers. Please be aware that the content of this podcast may be subject to copyright. Unauthorized copy, distribution, and reproduction of any part of the podcast is prohibited.